I'm Jackie. I debated for Planet OS with Jennifer, who's unfortunately not here because she's camping.
Yeah, and I'm Ryan. I debated for Corona del Sol, and Sreya's still studying for SAT subject tests and doing junior year stuff. Her January cases. Wait, I think it's the exact same case as the one broken down in the Emory finals round. So I don't think we need to break that down again, but the case is accessible online. So this time, instead of doing like speech by speech, like the way the last like analysis was done, I think we're just going to do it by like some overall themes of the round and how to like address that, maybe with drills, things like that. So do you want to go first about the rebuttals? You can talk about mine too. Roast me a little.
Yeah, okay. So with regards to rebuttals, so I guess go watch the rebuttals first.
Time starts now. Start at the top. Even if they win their entire case, they still lose the round because developing nations are going to outweigh for two reasons. The first is that these countries have a much worse safety net because they aren't the world's reserve currency, so they aren't able to expand fiscal stimulus at a large enough scale during recessions to get out of the recession because they don't have the fiscal space to do so, which means that recessions last a lot longer, and in general, these people are less able to get out of recessions. But secondly, more importantly, we would say that these economies in general are less durable and experience higher levels of poverty, which means that any dollar increase or decrease in their income matters a lot more than the amount of change in income in America, which means that we would say that this analysis means that that developing nations is always going to outweigh their case. But let's go to their case about infrastructure. There's three main responses I'm going to give to the contention. The first is that municipal bonds which fund infrastructure on a local level are going to be harmed when you vote for them in two reasons. The first is crowding out. What Samuelson of MIT writes is that when the US borrows a lot, money goes to US Treasury bonds and sucks away capital from the rest of the bond market. The problem is, what Hudson 16 says is that that municipal bonds for local infrastructure are one of the most common alternatives to Treasury bonds. So when the supply of Treasury bonds takes more capital, there's less capital left for municipal bonds. But secondly, more importantly, is going to be a credit downgrade. What Burke's 11 says is that if America doesn't take action to pass a debt reduction policy now, one of the three rating agencies is going to downgrade America's debt from a AAA rating to a AA rating. And that's really problematic. Because what 018 of MarketWatch writes is that this year, Fitch, one of the three largest credit agencies, is already threatening to downgrade our debt. If this happens, that's really detrimental for municipal bonds. Because what Mart 11 says is that when the US debt gets downgraded, it also results in downgrades on municipal and state level bonds across the board, because these rating agencies don't want local actors to have a higher credit rating than US debt. When that happens, their interest rates are a lot higher because of the fact that their credit rating is a lot lower. People are less willing to lend with them with the lower credit rating. This has two implications on their case. First, we would say that federal spending is a lot worse than municipal local level spending, because Rookie 17 says that federal investment is misallocated and it goes to areas where it's politically the best for politicians to do so because of lobbying into certain areas. On the other hand, municipal bonds are given to local politicians who don't have the sway of special interests affecting them. But that's why Oyakago in 2015 writes, in the past 9 years, we've seen $1.65 trillion of investment due to municipal bonds, which means the municipal bonds are always the preferable alternative to their case. If you really want infrastructure spending, you're not going to go through the political process of Congress, you're going to give it to the local level. Two more responses. The first is the GAIN Act. What Kelly 18 writes is right now in Congress there's a bipartisan piece of legislation that both Republicans and Democrats support called the GAIN Act, where it sells for federal assets, and 50% of the revenues it gets goes to reducing the debt, and the other 50% goes to infrastructure. This has two implications on this case. First, it implies that there is no trade-off between reducing the debt and infrastructure spending, which means that their advocacy is not topical. But second, it means that when you vote for us and you preclude the current plans on the table, like the Trump's plan, what Free Market 18 says that Trump's plan is really bad because the money only goes to wealthy areas, you instead shift to the GAIN Act. And the GAIN Act is preferable because the GAIN Act targets specific areas that need the money a lot more, so the investment is a lot better in our world. But the third reason that you're going to vote for us is because if we don't do anything now, infrastructure spending is going to be crowded out anyways. Because what Peterson Foundation writes is due to rising interest rates right now and rising debt right now, our interest payments are set to skyrocket. Indeed, Code 16 writes that in 10 years, 99% of our budget is going to go to mandatory items and interest payments. it's crowding out any discretionary spending on things like infrastructure. However, what Peterson Foundation writes right now is that if you cut and start reducing the debt right now, you only need 1.9% of the budget cut for every year until 2048. If you wait 5 years, those cuts are 21% larger. If you wait 10 years, those cuts are 53% larger, which means that we have to cut more infrastructure spending if we wait. Now is the time to do so. This link turns every single piece of analysis in their case, because right now it's an inevitability. You should vote F.
Ryan's rebuttal. Obviously, the weighing takes out a lot of our case, so that's very strategic. So Ryan does this thing where he reads disads, and you'll notice he spends like a lot of time reading links. So for example, he reads a contention that is like, oh, municipal bonds get crowded out, and municipal bonds are better than federal bonds. He spends a lot of time reading, reasons why municipal bonds are disadvantaged with the introduction of federal bonds, but he doesn't spend a lot of time explaining why municipal bonds solve the problem better than federal bonds. And I think the same problem is present with the second dissent, which is the GAIN Act, which is that he doesn't really implicate why it is the case that these two responses are going to be better solvencies than the negative solvency right now, which is really important, because whenever you're reading these types of arguments where you are offering like a disadvantage, you need to make sure that you like really pile on the weighing, because you could read like the most brilliant links in the world, but if you don't have the weighing, obviously that's there's going to be a problem there. The third response is good. It's definitely like a standard response, right? So that's probably the one response that that obviously Ryan's probably going to collapse on, or Australia is going to collapse on in summary, just because it is like a very good and topical response. So yeah.
Just to quickly add on to that, I think in general, this highlights something that should happen when you're constructing arguments in your block file, but this also happens for when you're writing cases, which is you should prioritize what is debatable, not prioritizing what is like more true. So what I mean by this is like, I read like, for example, in this first response about municipal bonds, I read 2 links about municipal bonds being crowded out. But if you think about that argument, it's probably more true that municipal bonds get harmed and less true that municipal bonds are better. So I needed to do more work proving that municipal bonds are better than work proving that they get harmed, and not doing that provides a weakness in the response that Jackie like eventually does exploit in second rebuttal. So on the converse of that is when you hear responses to your case, or when you hear arguments in like that your opponents read in contentions, it should always be like identify the weaknesses in the contention or the places in the contention or response that are less true that you can attack, rather than sort of like responding to every single part of that. It's a lot more efficient to just say like, yeah, maybe municipal bonds get harmed, but those are worse for 3 reasons or something like that, which is what Jackie does, unfortunately.
Start on the developing countries argument. He says that developing countries are going to outweigh any type of impact in today's debate. There's 2 reasons why the negative also links in developing countries. First, because lack of United States growth eventually reverberates throughout the economy. We would say that if the US slows down its economic growth, this has a reverberatory effect across the globe as investors start pulling assets and stop investing in other countries. But second of all, we would say that if you're going to actually cut the deficit like in the affirmative rule, you would cut things like foreign aid that directly go to these developing countries, especially because in times of past, when Obama tried to pass laws in 2013 to try to appease the Tea Party Republicans who wanted to reduce deficits, he cut foreign aid. So we would say this is a much more direct link, because this is aid that is actually going to developing countries. Let's go to the negative case. The first thing he talks about is municipal bonds. I would say that there's 2 reasons right off the bat you don't vote for this case. First, because municipal bonds are not enough to actually stimulate federal infrastructure spending. This is really important because McBride said that despite municipal bonds, our infrastructure right now is pretty trash. I would say in cases like disaster relief, there is no way that a local government can raise that amount of money in such little time in order to spend money and recover from things like disasters, which require a lot of money to recover from. So I would say on scale alone, federal government spending is a lot better. But let's look at the individual arguments. First, they talk about crowding out. The problem with this is that investment is not zero sum. In fact, Brady writes that there is enough investment to go around, that investors can buy things like treasury bonds and also corporate bonds and other bonds that they want to buy at the same time. So at the end of the day, investment isn't zero sums here. But second of all, they say that credit ratings are going to downgrade the debt to GDP ratio, or downgrade debt ratings. The problem with this, as I'll explain later, the University of Maryland finds that for every $1 you invest in infrastructure, you increase GDP growth by $3. This is really important because what determines the debt rating is not necessarily the actual amount of debt, it's the debt to GDP ratio, because that actually determines how likely it is that you actually pay back your debt. So if we can prove that GDP growth is going to outpace debt growth, then debt to GDP ratio shrinks, even though our debt is actually increasing. But finally, they say there are 2 reasons why municipal bonds are together. Group them both, because I'm just going to tell you that municipal bonds on scale don't raise enough money to actually go to federal infrastructure spending. Then they talk about the GAIN Act. 2 responses. First, the GAIN Act has there's not enough support for the GAIN Act. Just because it was created by a Democrat and a Republican doesn't mean that Democrats are going to support it in the House and Republicans are going to support it in the Senate. But second of all, we would say that this act is specific to selling assets by the Department of Agriculture. We would say that's not enough to actually start reducing the debt. You still need federal spending to start spending in infrastructure. But third, they talk about crowding out. The problem with this is that actually they say that, well, interest payments are going to rise. The problem with this is that they say we're going to have to cut later. The problem here is that why can't we just borrow money to pay off this interest? They don't really tell you why all of a sudden cuts are going to be incredibly necessary in the future. Then let's go to the affirmative case. A couple of big problems. First, realize that bonds from developing countries are always going to be less preferable just because in developing countries, they're more likely to have problems like corruption and systemic economic problems that will prevent their bonds from actually becoming more secure than U.S. bonds. This is really critical because Jennifer gives the analysis that as long as U.S. bonds are more preferable than developing country bonds, then investors who are investing in U.S. bonds won't shift to bonds from developing countries. They'll just shift to bonds from other developed nations like China, for example, which has a AAA rating. That means bonds from Argentina and Turkey are never going to be bought by investors who would rather buy U.S. bonds. But let's go on to the individual warrants. First, they talk about investment flows. Again, like I said, investors who buy U.S. bonds and investors who buy bonds from developing nations have the different incentives. She concedes this in first cross when she tells you that investors who buy bonds from developing nations are looking for higher returns and not necessarily more security. But second of all, realize that investors don't buy U.S. bonds, they're going to go buy Chinese bonds. Bloomberg 2019 finds that this is already happening because Chinese bonds are very similar to U.S. bonds in terms of security. They would never actually go buy bonds from developing countries. Then on to dollar denomination. First, realize that this is contingent on U.S. bond interest rates increasing, which in turn is contingent on demand for bonds decreasing. There are two reasons why demand would never decrease. First, because Bloomberg explains the demand is always high because treasury bonds are always seen as the safer investment compared to things like stocks. This is why demand for treasury bonds increases in times like a recession, for example. Second, because of debt to GDP ratio, the only way investors would increase their debt interest rates is because they think that the U.S. can't pay it back. That doesn't happen if the debt to GDP ratio decreases. But third, realize that foreign investors, because they're buying Chinese bonds right now, China's increasing its buying of U.S. bonds because it wants to keep its currency artificially low. So we would say in any case, it is likely that demand for U.S. bonds would never decrease, never triggering the interest rate rise they talk about.
On my rebuttal. So first one, the responses to the overview. So a lot of these, which I have probably a similar problem, is that I don't really implicate a lot of my front lines. So here we try to link into developing countries. And obviously, from reading the cases, you know that our negative contention doesn't explicitly link into this overview. So Jennifer and I are a little bit screwed at this point. So we pull out two responses. The second response is a sort of new piece of offense, so foreign aid that gets cut. You'll notice that this response, like, one, is not implicated, and two, there's zero like impact card or actual card being read, when this is like a completely individual response that is not reliant on our negative contention. So what I should have done is I should have either A, just not have read it at all and just have gone for like lack of US growth probably hampers developing countries, because as Ryan mentioned, this is probably like the more true argument, so it's probably the one that you can win a little bit easier. Or the second thing is if I really wanted to go for foreign aid, which again is risky because obviously the foreign aid impact turns and etc. But if I really wanted to go for it, I needed to read some type of impact card or some type of extension or like some type of real world scenario in which foreign aid has been beneficial. I also think that there are ways for me to implicate both these responses directly and interact directly with the developing countries case, and that I could have just been like, look, if foreign aid gets cut, it probably exacerbates the debt default crisis, etc., and just made that interaction a little bit clearer. So with responses to the dissat, so you'll notice at this point, I realized that it's probably pointless to attack the links because those are probably more true. So what I go for is the weighing. So I just say that like, oh, municipal bonds probably don't matter. The GAIN Act probably doesn't matter. On my response to the third warrant, all I say is that, oh, we can probably borrow money to pay off interest. Obviously, this is like a response that could be true, but it is not like nearly implicated enough, especially because I know that this is the one response that probably is true and is going to be extended. So I should have spent a lot more time on this one response and less time probably on like municipal bonds, given that I already know that like municipal bonds probably just on scale aren't going to solve. On the responses on their case. So one thing that I realized is that some of these responses, so if you kind of look through the responses, I only have 3 real responses, but I extend it into, I think, 6 responses, is because I always like try to cross-apply the responses and explain how they directly interact with Ryan and Shreya's case. So I get to this contention, and to be quite honest, like I don't really know. This contention is quite confusing, and at this point, I'm a little unsure about what the case is supposed to be. So I think that in first cross, Jennifer does a good enough job of explaining that there's probably some element of competition. And as a result, I'm thinking like, look, we just have to prove that they don't compete. And I also hear that, oh, this convention is contingent on interest rates going up. So I read these responses that are like, oh, demand is super, super, super high. And what I meant to say with the responses is that demand is super, super, super high. So it doesn't matter if the supply will change. The demand is so high that the supply change will result in a negligible change in the interest rate. And then I should have brought up some type of empiric that is like, Treasury bond interest rates have not changed within the last 10 years. I don't do this. And I think that probably hampers us way later in the round because it forces Jennifer in a much more constricted summary to bring these responses up. And it also probably increases the likelihood that the judge is not going to buy this response. So I think that obviously, like, I didn't, at that point in time, I had zero clue that like this contention was about supply. I genuinely thought it was about demand. But I think that if I knew it was about supply, I should have just implicated more. So I think the general takeaways from my rebuttal are that you need to find out, like, you need to implicate your responses and explain how they interact with the arguments that you're responding to, or explain how they interact with your own arguments and how they're going to win you the round very early on. And I understand that, like, sometimes it may seem strategic not to do this until later because it means that your opponent probably doesn't have as much time to respond. But it simultaneously also means that the judge is less likely to buy the response because it comes up much later in round. So I think a good idea is probably just to implicate these responses a lot more. And in turn, I could have consolidated a lot of my responses on their case, given that a lot of them are basically the same.
Yeah, I think just one more thing about rebuttals is that I think that in general, this is an instance where sometimes like the length and like quality of your like response matters. Like the reason at the round robin that we read these disadvantages against infrastructure is we thought that they were more like unique or like more clever responses that would be more difficult to frontline, and as a result we could win off them. But if you like really look and break down at the responses, they are so lengthy and like contrived, and like I read like multiple warrants for every single one, that the time trade-off might not be worth it, rather than me just reading 8 or 9 like non-unique like responses or just quick delinks. Given that we know, for example, in this scenario that we are going to collapse on our case and on that third response about cuts being inevitable, it seems maybe a little silly for me to have read less responses that are like super contrived and not very like strategic. So that time trade-off definitely needs to come like when I'm preparing a block file. Like after this round ended, we did walk out, and like when covering this round with our coach, Kale was just like, you need real responses to infrastructure that aren't like these random disads. So we did end up writing like better responses we read during the tournament, which I think is a lot more strategic.
Start in our case, you can group her overview. It doesn't apply to our second warrant about interest rates. But then at the top of our case, remember Zumbrun says that more than 45% of low-income countries are at the risk of default. And NERM says that if we don't solve our debt right now, millions will go into poverty if they do default. But then go to our second warrant. You can group all the responses she gives you because she doesn't understand our warrant, and those responses don't apply. It's not about investor demand for treasury bonds because that's always high, but it's about supply. And if the supply of treasury bonds increases, then that means that there's going to be more competition, which means that interest rates are going to rise and the price of bonds are going to decrease while the yield increases because they're inversely related. At that point, you can extend your second warrant because Hike says the government issues bonds to pay off. When the government issues bonds to pay off our federal debt, it leads to increased interest rates. And Sabila says that from 1971 to 2012, 1% increase in the deficit led to a 0.21% increase in interest rates on bonds, which means that it has present and it will happen. And then Bartonson says that over 2/3 of the debt is held by emerging markets is dollar denominated, and Thornton says that 1% increase in the debt leads to a 1% increase in interest rates in emerging markets. But then at that point, Richter says that if we don't solve this now, by 2025, emerging markets will owe $2.7 trillion of US dollar denominated debt. But then go to their case. First, you can extend our weight overview. Her first response is that there's a lack of U.S. growth, but U.S. growth is good, like there's no risk of growth slowing. But then second, on foreign aid, Dean 15 of Princeton University writes that foreign aid means that the regimes are less accountable because they don't have to rely on tax revenue, which means that they can do whatever they want and get away with it. But then you can extend our overview at the point where developing nations should be prioritized because they have a worse safety net, they can't pass fiscal stimulus, but also the less durable recessions are longer. But then go to the third response on infrastructure on their remember, so they say that we tell you that an increased interest rates and increased debt means that we have increased interest payments. She says that why can't we just borrow to pay off? But that means that this will just lead to increased interest rates and higher interest payments, which is a cycle, and the government won't do that. But at that point, Peterson says that we can cut spending by 1.8% per year till 2048. In 5 years, it would have to be 21%. In 10 years, it would be 53%. And that links to the case because that means we would have to cut infrastructure spending a lot more in the future.
Just like, how do you decide what to go for in a round like this? Like, especially, and I like Jackie's probably going to undersell this. But I think like Jackie makes a lot of really good strategic decisions in second rebuttal, which sort of puts Ray and I in a position where it's like harder for us to give a good summary that actually like just solidly wins us the round. I think then like our strategic collapse in this round was actually pretty good relative to I don't think we made any clear strategic errors in the summary and back half of the round. And I think that part of that was that we read so few real responses that it was very difficult for us to mess up that strategy in the back half. But the way we sort of decided what to collapse on in summary and the back half of the round in general is we saw the round as like a few ways. We always looked at weighing first in every single round, regardless of what was going on. Either Stray would be reading new weighing or she'd be extending the weighing I give in rebuttal. So in this instance, Jackie does a pretty good job, or Jackie does respond to the weighing and she concedes that developing nations come first. So we know that on the weighing front, it's pretty easy for us that if we win our case, we're winning a solid link into the developing nations. So now our task on the weighing level is to shut down their access to this like weighing that we do. And if you watch Second Crossfire, like I already begin this process even before we get to summary. Like all of my questions are targeted about that weighing. And so our task in summary is on the weighing level to shut down their access to the weighing. Because if they don't access their weighing, none of the offense they go for, since Jackie doesn't read turns on our case, matters at all, which means that we automatically win the round, assuming we're winning like any part of our case. Which means that on the weighing level, we prioritize that first. We see a conceded opportunity there. We need to shut down their access to weighing, so we collapse on that. The second thing we observe is that Jackie gives like very good responses to the first two disads. And on the other hand, her front line to the third disad is more or less like the same response she gives to our second warrant of our case, which is just demand is always high. Why can't we just borrow money? Why does the debt matter, right? So we sort of identified then that if we win our second warrant, we also win access to this turn, which is why even though Jackie gives about the same number of responses to like the same to our two warrants, we identified that winning our second warrant is more strategic because it also gives us access to the third link turn about cuts being inevitable. So we spend a lot of the rest of the debate focused on the idea that like maybe demand is always high, but when you increase the supply of bonds, that increases our interest rates. So this sort of idea means that like we're sort of grouping the arguments here. And I think that this is something that's strategic in general, which is just because like one of your links might be a little more undercovered than your other link is, realizing that your other link is a lot more strategic in the round, A, for weighing purposes, or B, for winning like residual offense on things like turns. It's a lot more strategic, which is why we went for the second warrant and the third turn about cuts being inevitable, because we sort of observed that those two paths to the ballot provide us a much better opportunity to like sort of win that round.
They go for interest rates, but that doesn't get them out of the response that Jackie told in Rebuttal, where we tell you that U.S. bonds and developing countries' bonds aren't substitutes. That means the investors who buy U.S. bonds will not go over and buy developing countries' bonds. What this means is that the two bonds aren't in competition. So even if United States interest rates were to increase, that doesn't mean that developing country interest rates have to increase to compensate. But then on the specific warrant, realize that even if they try to tell you that supply increases because of the U.S.'s specific bonds, like demand will always increase to compensate. That's for a couple reasons. First, because Bloomberg tells you that they're the safest form of investment, so people always demand them. Second, because our debt to GDP ratio is still really good, so it really doesn't matter. But then finally, because China and other countries are just going to buy more U.S. bonds because they have a bunch of U.S. money and they don't really know what to do with it. That delinks them from increased interest rates. But then, on the negative case, first on the top, they try to tell you that developing countries outweigh, but realize economic growth is a prerequisite because if the U.S. isn't in economic growth, no one's going to invest in developing countries. But then remember that cutting foreign aid is still a lot better to help developing countries because like the USAID doesn't give money to governments. They do specific programs that circumvent government corruption. But then on the specific infrastructure response, the only response she gives you is that interest rates increase, so this is really bad. But remember, I give you three very specific reasons as to why, because demand doesn't decrease, we can just keep borrowing borrowing forever because people will always borrow our bonds. That means you kick out of their term. That's why you can extend our case where we tell you that Trump's infrastructure bill would probably pass, and even if it doesn't pass, if you prioritize debt reduction, you're only going to cut infrastructure. That's really problematic because we tell you that infrastructure leads to better things like disaster relief. For example, Krauss tells you that every natural disaster increases poverty by 1 percentage point. However, if you invest in disaster relief, then that impact goes away. Second, on jobs, because McKinsey tells you that every time we invest in infrastructure, you create 1.5 million jobs. That gives jobs to people who are unemployed. That's really important because we outweigh on probability. You never know that investors are going to all of a sudden switch their portfolios from U.S. bonds to developing bonds if bonds decrease. But you know that when you invest in infrastructure, you're increasing the resistance of communities to disaster relief, and you're increasing jobs for millions who need it. Therefore, you negate.
Yeah. So from Jennifer and I's perspective, we have a lot harder of a job in terms of collapsing, especially because of this overview. And I would just say, like, in general, the developing, like, when you're writing cases, obviously don't like make an argument that is going to stretch to the limits of the imagination. But it is a good idea to try and find a link into developing countries, especially because this overview is like pretty well known and also pretty unattackable. So it's very likely that if you run a contention that doesn't link it to developing countries, you will get slammed pretty hard, which is what we're doing right now with the overview. And like after this, we did go change our case and we added like links to developing countries just to avoid that mistake in the future. So at this point, Jennifer and I are looking at the flow. So Shreya has already given her summary. So we're looking at the flow. They go for their second warrant, which is like, going to. But we noticed that they functionally don't respond to this response.
You cut out.
What?
Cut out for the last like 5 to 10 seconds.
Okay. What is the last thing I said?
Jennifer and I were looking at the flow after Shreya had given her summary.
Okay, so Jennifer and I were looking at the flow after Shreya had given her summary. So we noticed on Ryan and Shreya's side of the flow. So we noticed that the link is supply is going to increase. So, but we also noticed that like one of the responses that they don't go for is on the first warrant, but it's also applicable to the second warrant, which is that functionally there's no competition between these investors because one of them is looking for high returns and the other one is looking for safe investments. So we decide to extend that one because that one's also responsive to their second warrant. And the second thing we decided to do is that we're like, okay, supply increases, but it is the case that demand is so high that it doesn't even matter. So I think that Jennifer does a good job implicating the first response. And you'll see that in the video, she does a pretty good job of explaining why this lack of competition means that they're not going to access their impact. She does a little less good of a job implicating the second response, which means that we are forced as a team to implicate the response to second final focus, which is way too late. So I think that a good lesson from her summary, especially on like this side of the flow, is that you need to start implicating responses like early as possible. Like as soon as we realize that contentions about supply increases, we should have immediately just been like, demand is super high, means that any supply increase is negligible, let's move on. Obviously we didn't do that, which put us in a very tight situation. But given that we are the second team, it is much easier for us to collapse because Ryan and Shreya have already made their moves, so it's very easy for us to just look at like, oh, what are we going to collapse on? The collapse on the negative case is a little bit more not strategic, and I'll explain why. So we effectively concede the developing nations overview. And you'll notice that Jennifer goes for this kind of like blippy foreign aid thing, which like at that point we should have realized that if we're going to spend that little time on it, it's just better to drop because like it's never gonna like no judge is ever going to be like, that's what I want to vote off of because it's just so short and so poorly explained and so poorly implicated that we honestly shouldn't have spent
Apparently one of the two judges did vote on that.
Well, we should have realized that a judge was probably not going to vote off of it. So it's probably not strategic to go for it and spend like 20 seconds on it. So what we should have done is if we were going to go for infrastructure, and you'll notice that Jennifer does spend a lot of time on infrastructure, we should have gone all in on the first response to the framework, which is that U.S. growth it reverberates across the entire world economy and is responsible for fueling growth in developing countries. So Jennifer should have spent a lot more time on that first link, completely dropped the second link, and gone for infrastructure. Obviously, like the collapse on our side is a little more unstrategic, just because from the way the framework debate pans out, it's unclear how our two cases interact, which makes it a lot harder on both sides, I think, to explain how one case interacts with the other. Obviously, Ryan should have an easier job because of the third response about Peterson, which is that you have to cut now, which is a direct link that sort of allows their case to also cut into our case. But we should have gone for that first link about U.S. growth reverberating across the world economy and just hammered it in, because that is like, if we lose that link, we're going to lose the weighing, and then we're going to lose to any like marginal risk of offense from their side.
Start on our case about the developing nation. The only response they extend is that demand will rise to match any increase in supply. The problem is all of the reasons they give you for why demand are high are already exist in the status quo. The demand always exists. It's not going to change or like increase or decrease just because of a change in supply. These are reasons people will always go to treasury rates. What happens when you vote for us? What happens when you vote for them? As the Higgs 18 evidence says, that when the government borrows more and more money and sells more and more bonds, that drives up interest rates by driving competition with other bonds. The Rebuttal evidence says that from 1971 to 2012, a 1% increase in the deficit has led to a 0.21% increase in the interest rate. Don't let them stand up here and make new analysis on interest rates being low. It's A, not made in the round, and B, this is isolating the effect for our case. The Bartenstein evidence says that 2/3 of debt in these developing countries are dollar denominated. This frontlines the idea that there's no substitution effect. The idea is very explicit because they are dollar denominated. When the interest rates rise for dollar denominated bonds, it directly leads to an increase in interest rates. That's why the 4011 evidence that doesn't go responded to says explicitly that a 1% increase in the government deficit in the United States leads to a 0.1% increase in interest rates in emerging markets. That's completely dropped. It's the empiric on what actually happens, which means they can't have access there. The Richter evidence says that by 2025 we'll have $2.7 trillion that developing nations will need to give back. And the Zombrun evidence says that 45% of low-income nations are on the brink of default, and NERV says that when this crisis happens, millions are going to be pushed into poverty. This outweighs anything they make in the round because developing nations comes first. They can see this. They say a few things. First, they say that America is going to slow down growth, and that spills over, and aid. Neither of their analysis are contextualized. We're giving you very explicit. It doesn't matter how much aid we're giving. It doesn't matter how much America's growth is happening. The fact is, when these countries have a recession, higher levels of American growth aren't going to do anything for them. Then on infrastructure, they don't have a link because Peterson 18 evidence says that we can cut 1.9% right now, or we can wait 5 years, in which case cutting goes up by 21%. Their only frontline to this is the same frontline they give to our case, which is that demand is going to rise. But remember, all of the analysis they give you for why demand is going to rise is that it says that demand is high. It doesn't say that demand fluctuates with supply. They don't give you any of that analysis. That's not how supply and demand works, and that's why you should
really. So now, like, about the final focuses, I guess. I think one thing that we do poorly throughout this round is like we sort of like underestimated the like possibilities of the responses to our case and sort of brush them off as like this doesn't really apply. So what I mean by this is Jackie in Rebuttal reads like 3 responses that are like demand is always so high that there's never a problem. And we sort of just like brush it off as like it's not about, like, I think the frontline in summary is literally just it's not about investor demand, it's about supply of treasury bonds. I think we also need to do a better job implicating, and especially when that part of the debate becomes so core for the debate as a whole. If we win that, we win the turn, we win our case, or we mostly win our case aside from like the response at the top, which means that we need to spend a lot more time, 1, explaining, and 2, possibly reading more responses to Jackie's response here. That would have made it a lot more like better for us to go like later on in the round. So like in final focus, especially, like I sort of even then just brush it off as like, oh, these are reasons like demand is always high, but it's not a reason why demand will compensate for supply or something like that. I think we need to do a better job like implicating. But sort of like we said in the last video in the Emory analysis is like final foci like almost never, or final foci almost never really matter if the summary does a good job collapsing. Like if you watch this round, at least in my final focus, there's almost like an exact mirror of the summary, and there's no real like analysis being made that wasn't in summary. It's like straight up just clean extensions of every single argument we go for, and then like I sit down, which I think that you need to be like setting up your summary to get that final focus at that point. And I think that in general, like final focuses, what they can do is crystallize the round a lot more. So if someone, for example, were to do a redo of my final focus, I think what they could do is sort of make like a more clear link between our second warrant and the third turn on their case about cuts being inevitable, because we sort of like do our analysis on that point like twice. Like I frontline it on our case and then I re-frontline it on their case, when we could have just said like at the beginning of our final focus that debt does matter, it causes interest rates to rise, and then win that argument and then say this means like 2 things. 1 is like the developing nations argument, and 2 is that cuts are inevitable. So I think that's something that we could do better with the first final focus. Do you want to talk about your final focus?
Yeah, just as a really quick note, when you have like core parts of your case, like what Ryan was talking about, demand and supply, it might be a good idea. And obviously this is dependent on time trade-off, but sometimes it's a good idea to have like a backup response. Be like, even if you buy the demand increases, it still doesn't matter because of this reason, just in case the judge doesn't so one, it preempts any type of response in second final focus. And two, just in case the judge doesn't extend your first response, there's a backup response. And this has helped like Jennifer and I in a lot of cases where the judge kind of really doesn't really understand the first response, but is totally willing to get the second response. And so we kind of have that backup. And I would maybe use this for like core links in your case that you like absolutely have to win the round. I obviously wouldn't do this for everything. Anyways, my final focus.
Start at the top. They say that developing countries are the most important. We say sure. We say that if you vote AF, you cut things like foreign aid that circumvent corrupt governments to help people out of poverty. This is really important. We are going to outweigh a probability here because you have no idea if investors are suddenly going to shift their portfolio to accommodate bonds that are completely different, but you know that aid programs are happening right now and benefiting people right now. Then on the first, we also say that like U.S. growth reverberates to the entire world, so it's probably good that we prop up U.S. growth because that is what encourages investors to keep borrowing and investing. Then on the first contention about developing countries, the terminal piece of defense that they drop in the round and therefore delinks them from the entire case is that these two bond markets are not comparable. They just say they're both dollar denominated. That just means U.S. investors invest in both developing country bonds and U.S. bonds, but they aren't substitutes, which means that when interest rates go up, even if you buy the interest rates go up on U.S. bonds, developing countries never hike interest rates on their bonds because they're not competing for investors who invest in safe bonds. They're competing for investors who invest in high return bonds. This is really important because as long as U.S. treasuries are comparatively safer, these are no substitutes. That automatically delinks them right there. But then on the analysis about interest rates, they say that, well, we never say demand increases. We say the demand is so high that any increase in supply is negligible. This is why Bloomberg finds that because treasuries are the safest investment, you see foreign investment and foreign purchases of bonds increasing even though our debt is increasing. This is why treasury yields are super low. But second of all, with debt to GDP ratio decreases, you'll never actually see the interest rate rise. And third, China is going to continue buying bonds to continue depreciating its currency, especially when foreign investors are buying Chinese bonds. This is really important because it shows that the interest rate rise never happens, which means they never link to the turn on our contention. That's where you go to infrastructure. This is really important. We tell you in the affirmative world, you cut infrastructure by 28.6%. In the negative world, you pass an infrastructure spending bill. This is really important for two reasons. First, on disaster relief, we tell you disasters increase poverty. The way to solve that for that is spending. That's what Krauss says. But second, on mobility, we say through construction alone, McKinsey tells you create 1.5 million jobs. On probability, you know these jobs are created, whereas you never know whether or not investors are going to suddenly shift their appetite for risk and all of a sudden invest in developing countries. For those reasons, you negate.
So at this point, so I'm going to start on Ryan and Shreya's case because I think I started there first. So at this point, so Ryan makes this front line that is like, oh, well, competition is there. Like, so Jennifer says competition doesn't exist means that rising U.S. interest rates will never drive up interest rates in developing countries. Ryan makes this response about dollar denomination. And so from listening to it, I don't really understand what he means. And I'm like willing to bet that the judge probably also doesn't understand what he means. So I kind of just explained like, this is what dollar denominated means. It like has no real application to the case. Here's the response that Jennifer read extended. And so that I kind of, and you'll notice that I do this in Final Focus, like I kind of harp on it a lot because that is like the one response that is, you know, like the demand and supply debate is a little bit more muddled, but that is the one response I think is like pretty clean on the flow. And so I kind of harp it up a lot. And then instead of second Final Focus, this is where I start doing the implications of like high demand for treasury bonds. This is like way too late in the round to be doing this. And I think this should have been done like at least in second summary. And if I were a judge, like honestly, I wouldn't be voting off this analysis just because it is like way, way, way too late. And this kind of just like a last ditch effort to clear up whatever like debate is occurring over there in case the judge doesn't buy like the first response that I give. But yeah, this is just like way too late and this should have been done like way earlier. Anyways, so moving on to the negative case. Really quickly in the overview, you'll notice that I again go over this thing about like U.S. growth reverberating. This is like never, ever, ever linked into the actual negative contention. I think like a more strategic thing to do would have just been to extend the negative contention about infrastructure and then tacked on the link into their framework at the bottom, or could have just been like, oh, like growth and jobs means U.S. growth means we increase growth developing countries means we meet their burden about developing countries. I think that just like provides a much clearer narrative than me like starting off on the framework and just being like, we link in U.S. growth, now moving on to their case, now moving back to our case, and then you force the judge to like link the framework for you. Then a bunch of extensions on infrastructure. I don't remember if I respond to do I respond to Peterson?
No, you dropped in Final Focus.
Okay, so I dropped
mad.
Peterson in Final Focus, which is like very obviously very unstrategic. I think that something that I could have done is, well, so I think that's something that Jennifer and I both could have done is like this response about borrowing money to pay off interest is like very contingent on like demand always being high. And the response that Corona gives is not that demand is not high, it is that demand is high, like that literally doesn't matter. So it's that supply increases. So if we had just been like, oh, demand is always high, means that people will always buy US bonds, it is kind of a way to get out of that turn while simultaneously, well, it is a way to get out of that turn by being like, oh, well, people are always going to lend the US money, so it doesn't really matter. It doesn't necessarily get us out of developing countries because we still have to like how that will affect developing countries. So obviously it doesn't completely get us out of that. But I think that a very good response would have just been like, they kind of concede the demand is very high. So that probably applies to Peterson. And that's just like, that would have taken me 5 seconds. And like, I obviously didn't do it. And it's like a huge mistake on my part because that is like a turn that's like probably very important. That's probably something that you vote off of. So like, yeah. So overall, when looking at like our strategy, I think that we just like go for way too much stuff. Foreign aid stuff, like, I don't even know why. So like, why? I don't even know why we go for it. We made it a contention,
so in sum, I think there are 3 important things that you like should learn from this round. I think it was a pretty good round, like in terms of cleanliness, like in terms of how clean the round was. Like the round was very clean on both sides, and both sides made very like deliberate and obvious decisions in the flow and what to go for. So I think there's 3 things that you should have sort of I can't speak English. There are 3 things you should focus on in this round. The first is that when constructing an argument, when making an argument, or even when responding to an argument, you should focus on the debatable and not the factual. So what that means is like, you should always focus on where an argument is at its weakest, and like read less arguments. Like no one is going to stand up, for example, and contest that developing nations might outweigh, or like maybe they will, but like no one will contest, for example, that municipal bonds will be harmed. They'll contest that municipal bonds are better. So I should have spent less time reading that response on the link level so long and more time on the impact level. So in general, strengthen the parts of your case that you think are the weakest, and sort of like you can, it's okay to like sort of skimp if for time purposes on the cases. Like nobody is going to stand up and say like, for example, like death is bad. Like that's a very obvious reason why nobody reads a card about that. It's like this, but more extreme. The second thing that I think you can learn from the round is that you should always focus on weighing and the clearest path to the ballot. So like on our part, we identified very immediately that we didn't need to go for much to win the round. Like our win conditions were either winning the turn on their case or winning our case, because we knew that our weighing was like pretty good, and like it was pretty conceded that developing nations outweigh, which means we knew what we needed to go for, and we just went for those 2 things. There wasn't any like nonsense in the flow. We didn't extend like these random responses about like the GAIN Act. We didn't extend any of that stuff. We tried to shut down their path to the ballot and at the same time go for our path to the ballot. You should always find the clearest path to the ballot for you and the easiest, like the path of least resistance. Like don't wade through a lot of responses just because you think like it's a response you like. Like I actually was really partial to the municipal bonds response before this round, but it just wasn't strategic in the round. There were a lot of responses on it. That's why we went for the third response argument, which only had like 1 response on it. The last thing I think you can learn is like something that both teams do pretty poorly is like implicating responses. Like we should have better implicated like what it means for like our second warrant in terms of their response being about demand and not about supply. We should have made that implication a lot clearer. We should have implicated the weighing. Like if they don't win any link to economic growth, then they don't win the round at all. They can't even link into our weighing. And that implication needs to come. And like on their side, things like they should have implicated that their responses to our second warrant also take out the turn about cuts being inevitable, things like that. So that sort of implication makes one, the round a lot easier for judges to evaluate, and B, just makes the quality of your argumentation a lot better. So I think that those 3 things are particularly helpful. In terms of how to improve those things, I think one of the drills that we always did with Kale that I thought was really helpful, and I don't know what drills y'all did with Matt or with Roby, but like we always did one, we would flow rounds that like maybe were a little messy, or we would like re-listen to rounds where we were very messy and identify clear paths of the ballot for us. Like sometimes it could have just been one turn that we needed to go for, and we went for our case and like 3 turns instead. Like identifying the path of least resistance, like by flowing around, and this is a more time-consuming drill, but I think it is really helpful. Honestly, I wish I'd done these round analyses like as a debater more. Like you do learn a lot from them. So I think that that's one very helpful drill in terms of the first point, or the second point about identifying the clearest path for the ballot. In terms of like implicating responses, I think a habit that I tried to get in when I was debating, and you can sort of see this in my rebuttal, is like at the end of every response, I would say like there are 2 implications to this argument, or there's the implication of this argument is, and I would directly apply it. Like the implication of cuts being inevitable is that infrastructure spending is going to be cut no matter what, and it's going to be cut more if we wait, which means you should vote for us if you want to support infrastructure spending. Things like that. That implication at the end of every response, at the end of every extension of your case, like that makes your arguments a lot more powerful and a lot more direct. Like in this case, a lot of my responses seem like completely irrelevant. Like I was reading like credit downgrade or like crowding out, but the implication to infrastructure spending is what was important. So I think that's a drill you can do. Just force yourself to say the implication of this is, like that sentence also just makes it really clear.
Yeah, I think I follow a lot of the same things. So a couple of things I would say is, number one, make sure that when you're reading responses initially, read the responses that are going to be strategic. And this kind of goes with what Ryan said about focusing on the things that are going to be harder to debate instead of the things that are true. I think that coming out of the first half of the round, we are reading responses that are actually we think that are probably going to actually be relevant, like the lack of competition and demand. So after rebuttals, we think that like there are probably less responses that they could go for. But in the second half of the round, and this is the second thing you would probably learn, is that we make a lot of strategic mistakes based on what we want to collapse on. And whereas Ryan and Shreya have a very clear path to the ballot, we kind of muddle ourselves up a little bit by going for so many things that are probably irrelevant. Like we could have not gone for foreign aid. We could have not gone for this stuff about how demand is going, like the 3 reasons about how demand is going to increase. We literally didn't have to extend all 3 because they kind of just said that, okay, demand is very high. Like we could have just extended 1 and been fine. And I think Jennifer does extend all 3. So like, yeah, just like picking what to extend. Like, and I think that like we as a team, just like we did drills a lot less often, but something we would do is like after every round we debated, we would go back and try to see like, was a path to the ballot conceivable if we had collapsed on this turn instead? Or was a path to the ballot conceivable if we had collapsed this warrant instead? And kind of working out like, if we had done this, what would have been the final scenario? If we had done this, what would have been the final scenario? And kind of figuring out the path that was the path to the ballot that was easier. And I think like the last thing, again, implicate your responses. And I think that this kind of goes along with like a trend in the PF community, which I think is like a lot of people like to read like a lot of responses. But the problem with that is that like very few of them ever get implicated. So a judge is rarely ever willing to vote off of it, right? If I'm a judge, I'm going to be willing to vote off of a response that's much more implicated, that I understand the implications much more because I don't have to connect the dots myself. Whereas if you read me like 4 responses, like, yeah, sure, they might all be responses, but if you don't tell me how they interact with the argument, it's very unlikely that I'm going to vote off of them, especially if the other debater has already done the work. So I think that, for example, for both of us, what we could have done is just like dropped a lot of arguments and just the arguments that we did believe were essential to the round, just implicate those and just be like, here's how this responds to this argument. Here's why this means they don't get a pass about it. Here's why you vote for us. And just doing that would have been a lot more helpful. In terms of like how to implicate responses, I think that a lot of this is very contingent on like what you write in your block file. And I would encourage you to start implicating responses like in your block file. Like, for example, if you have responses in your block file, try to like, for example, if I have a block file, right, and I have like A2 developing countries and I've written like these responses, I need to like in my block file explain like implicate these and explain how these responses interact with my case and their case in the block file, as opposed to just writing them, which I think is probably pretty helpful in terms of helping you implicate stuff in the round.